Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the second session of the day in the Responsible Business Summit. There's someone at my door, which I will try very hard to ignore. I'm quite busy at the moment on an investigation, which is coming out later this month. So I'm working quite late in the office. And for the last 2 weeks, there's always been one person in the office who's worked even later than I have. And that's Patricia Clark, who sits next to me. And who, with Alexandra Mousavizadeh and Luke and Kim and a host of others, have been putting together this 6th iteration of the R100 Index. And it's been a huge lift, but it's definitely been worth it, because what's happening now is, now the index has been going for a couple of years, we're starting to see trends in how the biggest companies are behaving in pretty crucial ways. And that gives us an insight that we just simply didn't have a year or so ago. So I'm really excited to discuss the results of the index in this session with Alexandra and with Patricia and with Luke. So I think that we should just kick off with Alexandra first. But again, if anyone thinks that anyone is saying anything interesting in this discussion, then post it in the chat, and I will bring you into the conversation. So let's kick off with Alexandra. Can you just tell me, Alexandra, how the index works? How does it differ from other ESG measurement platforms?
Thank you, Alexi. Did you need to get the door? Are you okay? Okay. I mean, what a great tee up also with the conversation with Paul and all of the great questions that were in the chat. It speaks to many of the things, and all of the things that we're trying to do with the index. And Alexi, as you said, it's in its 6th edition now, and requires a big lift from the team. So huge thanks to the entire team for this. It's sort of, we start looking at the update sort of in the middle of the summer, and so it goes through rigorous data collection processes and error checks. And 6 a.m. this morning, we produced the final rankings, and they're on the website, and they'll be put in the chat by Kim, and Patricia and Luke will share lots of information on that also as we go through the session. But it's on the so the fresh rankings are on the website with the methodology report, and we'll try and get to as much as we can in this session on the results. But as you said, maybe just a step back to answer your question, Alexi, about what it is that we set out to do with this index. And as we know, and to Paul's point about, which was a beautiful way to describe this sort of array of blooming flowers, which is sort of the very crowded space of ESG measurement platforms that we are seeing now, and a growing number of these more than ever. And for good reason too. And it's good to see many are trying to create the standards and metrics around measurement on ESG factors. But what we tried to achieve with this Responsibility 100 Index was to create even more urgency in the debate. And what we noticed wasn't out there was actually a concrete sort of metrics around what Bill was pointing to in the earlier session, which is the say-do gap. So what we went out to try and do was to create, look at what companies were saying they were doing versus what they were actually doing. And so trying to highlight that gap between the talk that companies do and the walk that they actually do. And so this is quite a unique framework, and also something that we've seen has created a lot of engagement, not only with the FTSEs, but sort of with the wider community that focuses on measurement of the ESG, because it was the first time that gap had actually been revealed. And so looking at that gap, especially if it's in the negative direction, so saying more than doing, it's something that we felt created some sort of concrete parameters around the say-do conversation, and really sort of crystallized that gap. And especially, as you know, this is looking at the FTSE 100, so it's the biggest companies here. And that's where we are, where we've started the index, and we hope to expand that further in the years to come. So just to answer sort of what it is that we were setting out to do. The other 2 sort of quick points I wanted to make for those who were sort of not as deep in the engine room of the index as we are, is that we rest all of the data in the index on publicly available data. And the reason that we do that was that it pressures companies to disclose, and it enforces more transparency. And while I think Jan's point about regulation and investors putting pressures on companies, which is incredibly important, none of that is doable unless we've got actually reporting to look at, because before we've got reporting, we can't actually track the changes and look at the performance changes across all of the sort of ESG aspects. So what we're trying to do is really encourage and push companies to report more. And almost the index is like a checklist. There's 120 indicators in there. And this is where we think is sort of the bare minimum of a company should be reporting on, and that we then start to track the performance of, or started to do that back in September 19. And the final point I'll make before we go to the results is that the index rewards the reporting as well as performance. So that is, companies that don't report tend to not do very well in the index, because you get a point for reporting. And that is exactly the as I was saying before, is to tease out and to encourage the reporting in and of itself. So, and then of course, positive change and the delta in that gets a high weighting. So we also very much reward companies that do well across all of the 6 pillars. So I think, Alexi, I don't know if anyone has any questions on that, or if you want us to go to the results side.
Well, I think it would be great to go to the results side, and I'm going to start off by looking at the press release that you put out for this, because press releases have a tendency to slightly kind of take the boldest finding of the whole process and put it at the top of the page, but it is fundamentally quite a depressing press release, because its title is "Companies Using COVID as a Cover to Row Back on ESG Goals." And when I was mentioning trends before, I guess there's no kind of more important place for trends to be measured than in the last 12 months or in the last 18 months, when we've gone through something kind of really unique and spectacular. So I guess my fundamental question, first of all, is what does the R100 show about how companies have changed their behavior over COVID? And is it fundamentally a negative picture?
I mean, and that, yes, I mean, I don't know if any of you had a chance to look at some of the points that were in the slides just before we started the session, and we can definitely share them. I mean, the interesting thing is that, I mean, the 2 companies that we highlight in the press release are rowing back on some fundamental critical issues, in our opinion, that then has seen a drop in the rankings. And I think you pointed to the fact that actually Landsec at the top of the index in the last situation has dropped to 9th place on account of a number of things. But one of the key aspects there is that they've dropped their accreditation to be a living wage provider. And I know that was something that Paul commented on before, but is that a correct thing to even if squeezed, is that something that we should try? And certainly the index does say, look, these are the things that you still need to be doing, and dropping it in sort of, and the question is it an excuse, or is there a real reason?
Just explain what happened with Landsec.
Landsec dropped it left the accredited living wage provider. So to become a living wage provider, you need to show that you're paying living wage to all of your direct employees. But it couldn't do that, and it couldn't live up to those standards. So it's dropped out of the accreditation. So it no longer has that accreditation. And if you no longer have that accreditation, in our index, that is one of the reasons it dropped from 1 to 9. But I thought that was a very good example of things that happened during COVID, where you can say, it is definitely happening because of COVID, but because of COVID, maybe this is precisely something that one should be sticking to and going through everything that you can to maintain that accreditation. So that's one example of.
And just before we move on to Tesco, which I think we also want to talk about, just to stick to Landsec at the moment, because it's a really interesting example of how to measure responsibility during COVID. As I understand it, the Living Wage Foundation permitted companies to pause their accreditation during COVID. In other words, it was kind of a concession that they made to companies during COVID, and Landsec kind of took advantage of that. And as I understand it, its direct employees are still paid the living wage, but employees across all its property portfolios are no longer, that commitment is no longer there. And I just wondered, what was your thinking about how much to ding them for that, basically? Because, you know, the living wage provider gave a particular exemption, or allowed companies to take advantage of a particular exemption, which they did. And is it really fair to criticize them for that?
I mean, it goes to the heart of the question, if I may. I'll answer that in a minute, of what the role of mandatory reporting is, right? Because is it fair if it's suddenly allowed not to report? Or should companies really step up and report, even though it's not a mandatory requirement? And we very much take the view, when you look at actually, you know, how if an indicator of something is not required reporting or mandatory reporting, companies really don't often do it. And we saw it across other indicators, such as it was also allowed by the government not to report on gender pay gaps and gender data. And many companies decided to take that opportunity and not report on that, which is something that is difficult to understand why one wouldn't keep doing something which we view as quite basic to do. So you can see that the minute that it's not mandatory, many companies choose to use as an excuse or a reason not to report, which is back to Jan's point about the regulation, the requirements that are put in place of reporting is absolutely essential, because if it's not mandatory, then companies often won't do it. You've got to then have a company that has, you know, where it's really part of its DNA, that reporting on performance and trying to improve performance is infused across the company. Because otherwise, you know, and you see the characteristics of the top 10, for example, those very much have in common that they're really good on reporting, not only on performance, but they really do cover many and most of the 120 indicators that we have in Blue.
What, Alexandra, one point being made in the chat by Tom Kenrick, which is really interesting, picks up on something that Paul was saying earlier when I put to him the Landsec and the Tesco examples, which is, yeah, they may have gone down, but other companies relatively have gone up. And it's the overall direction of travel that we should be interested in. So let's look at the overall direction of travel. Is that going in the right direction, or has COVID kind of lowered the bar overall?
Well, there's, I mean, in terms of reporting, just on that, we've seen sort of from the last iteration, we've seen 100 points not being reported on in this iteration. So there's definitely a rollback on reporting, which is very disappointing to see. On the other hand, you can see on, and Patricia is going to talk to this in a minute about the climate results that we've seen, that the emissions overall from the FTSEs have come down because of COVID. So what we're looking at is, well, that's sort of an external factor that companies not necessarily have been, you know, attempting to bring down. That's just a factor of, you know, the collapse in business and so on. So what we're going to watch, of course, in the following iteration is that just going to climb back up, or are companies going to make that effort? So we're seeing COVID having an impact positively and negatively across the 6 pillars, but some of the, would you say, sort of positive climate results may have nothing to do with efforts that are being made by the companies themselves.
I see that there's another really good point in the chat about whether we could do some sort of responsibility index for charities as well as for big corporates. Chris Chadwick is making that point. It's quite a good idea, Chris. We might steal it. But it's not all doom and gloom, right? I mean, Landsec has gone down for the reasons that we've talked about. But let's just, do you mind just talking about Severn Trent, the water company that's at the top of the rankings, and why it got there?
Yeah, I mean, Severn Trent shot to the top of the rankings because, again, you know, the characteristics of companies at the top, and that's the same for Severn Trent, is that they do really well across the board. They report incredibly well. They've got a closing gender gap. They have, strong commitments to reducing the negative environmental impact and so on. So you just see across the board, and you can see it on the screen there, that it's performed above and beyond the other companies in this round. Unilever has always been, and actually in the first many iterations, at the very top. And it's not that Unilever's scores have necessarily come down, but it's just that we're seeing companies that are really sort of making this a real focus for them across the board are now, and it's a relative scale, so they're shooting to the top, and that is the case for Severn Trent.
I mean, I don't know whether you want to answer this or one of the team wants to answer this, but I was really interested in Severn Trent and how it actually worked, because in the press release you say the direct emissions have seen a slight increase, but its waste production has nearly halved during the last reporting period. So, I mean, I'm just naturally thinking, how have they done that? Does anyone know?
Patricia, do you want to come in and take that question?
I don't know the specifics of how it works with Severn Trent, to be honest, Alexi, but what we have seen is that they have increased their reporting. So they've seen a slight increase in scope 1 and 2 emissions, so they're direct emissions, which can be for a number of reasons. It can be because of COVID. They've started increasing their production again after a sort of a bit of a slowdown, or they're having more demands on their business because of COVID. Probably, actually, they're a water company. They've also started reporting their scope 3 emissions. So as most of you will know, that's emissions across their entire value chain. A third of companies still don't do that. And we really value that reporting, because we consider that reporting absolutely crucial to how we view climate metrics in the index. And like Alexandra said, there's a lot of sort of human, what we, in our equality pillar, metrics that they've reported on really well. So gender pay, their gap is improving, and so on and so forth. So they've got sort of, our index really strongly values transparency across the board, which is part of the reason that they've jumped as far as they have. And it does also, value improvement, and the improvement on waste has, in this case, been so good that it's superseded the slight increase in emissions in scope 1 and 2.
Patricia, do you mind if I ask you about Tesco? Because I was quite surprised about Tesco when I read the results. So Tesco has dropped 41 places, I think, which probably is the biggest fall not only of this index, but of any of the iterations of the R100 index that your team has produced. So why has Tesco gone from being essentially a responsible company to something less than that?
So the biggest ding that Tesco had was the fact that they stopped being a signatory of the prompt payment code, which guarantees that they'll pay their suppliers within 30 days. This was widely reported.
Why did they do that? Was that COVID or something else?
That was COVID. They did get back to us when we got in touch with them for the article that we produced that Kim's put in the chat. They said, we're still paying our suppliers, but they've, as a result of COVID, they've no longer, been a signatory of that, which even though and they say, well, it doesn't matter because we're still doing it anyway. But obviously that sort of safety net that they build themselves isn't great, and our index really dinged them as a result of that. The other thing that they've stopped doing, they do still report on their food waste, and they are a supermarket, but they've stopped reporting across sort of key environmental metrics. So they no longer report on the amount of waste recycled, the total waste to landfill. Now, obviously, supermarkets have had a huge increase in demand in the past couple of years, and they've got to supply their staff with PPE and so on. And so you can imagine that is going to have an effect on the climate.
So can we just unpack that a little bit? So Tesco used to report all sorts of things about their waste, and now they report food waste, but not other types of waste. Is that right?
Yeah. That's correct. They've got a thorough food waste report, but they've stopped reporting across a lot of key metrics, which we've seen across the board. As Alexandra mentioned earlier, there was sort of 100 data points missing, which in isolation don't look so bad. But I guess the point I really want to make is that is kind of the point of an index, is that when you look at these little things in isolation, we had one company, for example, that stopped reporting its emissions intensity, and they told us that they stopped reporting it because their revenue had gone down and therefore it looked more intense. And you think, okay, that's the entire point of an emissions intensity metric. It's really important that you continue to report that even when your revenue goes down, even if it looks worse. That's the point of transparency. And it's just one metric, but when you look at it all sort of together in an index, that's when you see the real trend, and that's when you see why it's so important for these businesses to make a difference.
And just to get an idea of like how important you rank or how important you weight transparency. If I suppose it's a really difficult question to answer, but if a company like Tesco, if it saw their waste go up and it reported that its waste went up, would that cause them to go down the index more so than if they just stopped reporting that at all?
So it depends how much it went down. I will say, sort of, if you want to get really technical about it, because these indicators that ask whether or not a company is reporting on something are binary indicators, they weigh quite heavily in the index. So if we're saying, are you reporting at all, yes or no? The yes is quite a heavy response. The no is a heavy response, because we ding them with the absolute worst possible value when you don't report at all. And that is a conscious choice to make sure that we're sort of encouraging transparency. If the waste went down, what was the example you gave? Sort of if they made an improvement or if they did worse on their waste, then that would have an impact. Maybe not as much as a binary yes or no value, but it really depends on how much they've done. In the case of Unilever, for example, they've got quite big scope 3 emissions and scope 1 and 2 emissions. Actually, no, sorry, it's just scope 3 emissions. And actually, they've improved their emissions overall by about 29%. So we see that sort of, despite the fact they've got big emissions, that improvement really helps them. So it really depends on the metric. I hope that answers it.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And let's talk about climate for a moment, Patricia. If we could stick with you on that, you introduced 2 new indicators that allow you to measure net zero commitments more effectively. Is that right? Yeah.
So this time around, we introduced those 2 new net zero metrics. So one is just, does the company have a net zero target? And 2, what is the date of that target? Of course, this was partly a nod to the fact that Tortoise has a big accelerating net zero campaign going on at the moment. We partner with lots of companies and are sort of really pushing this as a key issue that companies need to address. And also because it is a bit of a moment for net zero, we sort of recognize the society that's something really important, and that is a genuine way that we could push forward for progress. The indicators, we had to do a lot of thinking around it, because sort of the idea behind net zero is that you're net zero across your entire value chain. But some companies have set net zero targets for just their scope 1 and 2 emissions. Some have set it across the board, and scope 1 and 2 being direct emissions. So it's a sort of thorny thing to try and iron out. Also, some companies have set one very far away target, 2050. Some have set interim targets to get there. Some haven't at all. So it's not a perfect comparison, but it does give us a very good sense of where companies are going.
And where are we seeing the biggest emissions come from, and who's kind of going up and down in that area?
So the biggest emissions are coming from, unsurprisingly, mining and extraction companies still. And those are just, we in the slides that we prepared for this that you saw earlier, we only looked at direct emissions because a third of companies still do not report their scope 3 emissions. So it makes it really hard for us to compare what's actually going on. And in many ways, scope 3 is actually the more important and hardest thing to change, and therefore needs to be reported. But on direct emissions alone, mining companies are still seeing the biggest emissions. Yeah. Well, it's slightly tricky with COVID. We've seen 22 companies increase their emissions this year, which is a lot. But we also know that they stopped production or slowed down production in many businesses for a while, and maybe are now going back to sort of a business as usual and seeing a slight increase there. So that could be a factor. Sometimes emissions increase because companies buy up other branches and so on, and therefore sort of take on a larger part of emissions.
I want to bring Gbedemah Albi in a second, but Patricia, I mean, we obviously hear a lot from these big fossil fuel companies about how they're going green and they're investing in green energy and they're changing. I mean, like, does the index back up those claims, or does it undermine them?
That's a good question. I guess what I find quite interesting in our index is that those companies never perform particularly well, even when they've got quite ambitious targets and even when they do a lot of good reporting, because what we're still, because of the nature of the business, we are sector agnostic, but from the massive amount of emissions alone, these companies are still not performing well. We've seen a bit of change, we've seen a bit of improvement, but it's not really reflected yet. I think we're still quite early on in the journey for that. And we do also capture targets, which, as many of you will know, don't actually come into our what we call our walk score. So we have a talk score and a walk score. The walk score is the ranking, it's how companies perform, and then we have a talk score. And a lot of these companies do set really good and ambitious and thorough targets, which is important, but we don't count that because we wait until we see action. And we are seeing a little bit of improvement, but not that much.
Okay, Jen Allerton is making a really good point in the chat about measuring carbon offsetting and net zero. So maybe if she doesn't mind, we can bring her in after speaking to Gbedemah. Gbedemah, you work or partly have worked in Tesco's, and you weren't aware of any of the changes that they'd made that Patricia had mentioned. Do you want to give your views?
Yeah, hello. Yeah, I was just confirming that I do work part-time at Tesco, and they send us regular emails telling us about their performance and so on, and it just sort of confirms my skepticism that we're not getting all the facts or all the news. You know, we're getting the good bits, but not the bits that reflect badly upon Tesco. Really, that's what I've realised from what I've just heard.
And what do you think? Because one of the things that the index also measures is how businesses treat people in a variety of different ways and through a variety of different metrics. On the ground, how do you think Tesco treats its employees?
It's hard to tell because I only have a view upon the one where I do work, but I would say that generally, although they have a target that one of the targets that people should be happy in the environment. People generally aren't, I would say, but it's hard to tell why. It's probably for a variety of reasons and so on, but that's my impression.
Thank you so much. Okay, well let's bring in Jen. I don't think that she can do video, but hopefully we can hear her.
Yeah, no, I can't at the moment, but I am here. Hello.
Would you like to make your point?
Yeah, it was about the net zero. I mean, I'm sure this will be touched on later when there's a whole session on carbon offsetting. Unfortunately, I've got to miss that one. But the point I made, basically, net zero sounds great until you realise nets are full of holes. And I wondered kind of how much you take into account the fact that net zero is, you can do things like tree planting and which is arguably a sort of, it can be good, can be less effective than other things, and also the carbon credit, so you selling carbon to other companies in essence, and how that kind of really takes out the whole idea of trying to achieve lower emissions, and yeah, that's sort of how much that is taken into account in these metrics.
Patricia, do you want to take that one?
It's really, really tricky, and you raise a really good point, and that's something we're really interested in our reporting. I know that Kim's thought a lot about carbon credits and this idea of selling off your kind of dirty assets is something that we look at really closely. We don't currently have a way of measuring that in our index. It is because we just sort of look at the raw figures, and therefore if you sell off a dirty chunk of your business, then it's not going to get taken on. But we are looking at ways to try and incorporate that, because I love that phrase, nets are full of holes. I think that's a really good way of looking at it. Yeah, it's a tricky one. It goes into the decisions we make about adding in new indicators and so on.
How transparent are companies on that as well, in terms of like if they sell off their sort of lower emissions?
Not at all.
Carbon credit
really.
Stuff. Yeah.
Not at all. What we found in previous iterations of the index is that we've seen sort of companies have a big drop, and when we ask them for comment on what's happened and how are we doing, what could we do to improve, at that point they'll be like, oh yeah, we we sold this off. but it's not plastered all over their annual report for obvious reasons, because it doesn't make them look great. Alexandra's got a hand up. Maybe you want to jump in.
No, I just wanted to echo Patricia's point. I mean, first of all, this is the question about, again, back to something that Paul mentioned on the standardization of measurement, right? Because there is no real agreement on how you measure these offsets. And actually, to your point, Jen, there's sort of the efficiency of them. And there have been many cases where, you know, carbon offsetting has been purchased, but then there's no tracking of whether that is real long-term, or the issues with the long-term offsetting. So there's got to be some kind of agreement of what that means and how you hold that to account, how you measure that over time, whether that is actually real. And then I think the issue is really important. And as Patricia said, something we really are thinking about, because how does one capture the offsetting? But also there's so much that is left to, you know, the question about technology will solve it. And the technology and investments going into solutions is definitely, as we all know, is picking up pace, to say the least. But a lot of the solutions are expected to solve some of the problems, and we don't know if that's going to happen or not. So it is also just focusing on sort of the core imprint and impact of a business. And I think sort of bringing it back down to sort of what is your, you know, what is your direct and indirect emissions and so on. And those are the, you know, the reasons the way that we've selected those 25 indicators in the climate pillar is because, you know, this is really core to what you can do and what you can control and what is relatively standardized in terms of measurement. And I say relatively because you've always got, you know, TCFD on the horizon, among others, that we might see convergence towards.
Okay. Well, we've got slightly under 10 minutes left to discuss some of the other aspects of the index. Modern slavery is one of the focuses of this iteration, and the person who has been kind of spearheading that is our colleague Luke Gbedemah. Luke, do you just want to kind of take us through how the index measures progress, not progress in that area?
Yeah, I can certainly try. We're going to be joined by some people from the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre a bit later on in the day, and they're super relevant here because what we did with the scoring that goes into the index was sort of mirror a methodology that they'd used for a number of years prior, which is to look at the statements issued by every FTSE 100 company in response to the Modern Slavery Act of 2015, and assess both sort of qualitatively and quantitatively how comprehensive those statements are and what they actually demonstrate about the action that the companies are taking. But
just talk us through very quickly the Modern Slavery Act, like what were the obligations set out?
Yeah, so this is something I've looked at pretty carefully, and hopefully there's a piece coming out later today that explains it in more detail. But in brief, the companies have to issue a statement which describes their actions, due diligence, risk assessment, and preventative steps related to labor abuse in their supply chain. So the law is problematic, though, and this is something I've spoken to quite a few civil society experts and charities and things about, in that it doesn't obligate companies to say anything specific. The wording of section 54 of the law, which is the part that's important for the statements, is you may include information about your risk assessment. You may include information about how you train your staff to address exploitation. So what that means is that amongst the FTSE at least, you get a big range of responses in these statements. Some of them are 40 pages of gloss, loads of stock images, loads of, you know the deal if you've ever seen an annual report by a big company. But the substance in terms of what's measurable and tracked over time is often really, really limited. I had a very interesting conversation with an NGO lead last week who said that you can often tell if a company has had a scandal around modern slavery in its past by how well designed its modern slavery statement is, i.e. how much sort of, how many assets and how many pages and how much copy has gone into it. And I think that's telling, because basically what we've tried to do is work out how companies are responding from the statements, but the conclusion we've drawn is that actual action being measured is very, very limited.
Out of the FTSE 100, how many are actually taking actual measurable action to prevent modern slavery?
Well, a majority of them, I think it's about 70 or 80%. They say that they're training their staff to identify exploitation, to understand whistleblowing processes and things. So that seems like a meaningful action. They're not obligated to tell us what that training is, how detailed and how much of it people do, but that's one thing. A majority also say that they'll take corrective action if they find modern slavery, rather than just terminating arrangements with suppliers. But only 14 of the companies, for example, tell us exactly what percentage of their supply chains have actually been risk assessed. And risk assessment normally means you send a surveyor or an investigator, or you do an audit, or you send someone undercover into a factory or a processing plant to look at the conditions there. So I guess the answer to your question, Alexi, is like, we actually need more clarity in order to say what companies are doing. And I think that's at the heart of the debate now about changing the law that was issued 6 years ago.
So there's obviously a problem in the measurement and in the metrics around modern slavery and in the incentives for companies to actually do anything about it and ensuring that it doesn't happen. But how is there any evidence to tell us how big a problem it is in the first place, especially for the big companies that we're measuring?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting one, because the companies are obligated to say when they have identified instances of modern slavery.
Yeah,
that is that's a fact. And the number of FTSE 100 companies that say they confirmed cases of modern slavery in their supply chains is 0. But the number of instances where they found signs of modern slavery, i.e. they found that workers were being made to pay extortionate recruitment fees in order to get a job at the company, or where they found that the working conditions were poor, or that people's wages were being withheld, or that subcontractors had been paying money into a bank account, or paying a salary into a bank account that wasn't owned by the person who was actually their employee. There are lots of those instances, but what happens is the company reports them, and then they say, we've taken steps to address these. Okay. So there's an ambiguity in that, which is like, where does the modern slavery start in official terms, and where are just, oh, this is a risk, or this is an indicator?
Okay, let me cut you off, because we've got 1 minute to go, and we need to also give people a break. So, Alexandra, do you just in 1 minute want to address some of the human factors that we've been looking at, the gender pay gap, maybe where ITV is, because they've been doing good work. But what do you have to say about that?
I'll try in 1 minute. I mean, the bottom line is that, again, it's down to mandatory reporting. You look at almost all, so 97 of the FTSE 100 report on female representation in senior management. But if you look at anything else other than that, you for example only got 18 companies that report on BAME in a similar category. 1 company reports on disability, and 2 on LGBTQ representation. So I mean, it's a really stark difference, and we're very aware of that. It's not always that easy for companies to get people to report on and self-report on these things. However, that's all about trying to create the culture to enable people to do so. And again, you know, it's not mandatorily, it's not a mandatory requirement. So sort of part of the reason is also, if you don't have to, many companies have then decided not to. So in terms of reporting, in the sort of last 10 seconds, we just see if it's not required, it doesn't really happen.
Well, I mean, I think you guys have done an absolutely unbelievable job. We didn't have a chance to talk about more than about 10% of it in this conversation now, but I'm sure that links are going to be posted in the chat where you can see a full set of results and really kind of dig into the data and the methodology that the team have used. And I'm sure that they would also like your feedback. So if you have any questions or points that you didn't get a chance to make in this chat, then just contact one of the team. Their email addresses will either be posted in the chat or they're on the results page themselves. So now it's time for a 10-minute break. Go and get a cup of tea. At 10 o'clock, we'll have a session on how COVID-19 has changed the game on business responsibility. And I'll leave the last word before we go off on that to Alexandra.
Thank you, Alexi. I just wanted to add that we are going to be also releasing our Climate 100 report in a couple of weeks. So please do look out for that. We'll send it around as well. It is the pillar in the index on climate that we slice out, and we do a lot of in-depth analysis on the indicators in and of themselves across the FTSE 100, but also looking at sectors and how they perform on the climate metrics, both when it comes to the talk side and also the walk side. So just wanted to leave you with that. Thank you, Alexi.
Thank you so much, and thank you, team. It's an amazing job. I'll see you guys and everyone else in 10 minutes. Have a nice day.